Good evening and welcome to the 12th edition of Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai International LitFest 2021, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej. Coming up now is a session I have always enjoyed because of the adrenaline rush it brings, the debate. Tonight's topic of debate is college students should not participate in political protests. I'd like to let you know that we shall be taking in audience questions, so keep typing away those questions in the comment section. And now, I declare the first audience vote open. This is vital for us to find out what you think of the topic, whether you are for or against the motion right now, because you are the ones that decides the results. You can vote by simply clicking on the link in the description below. Enter your email and vote for or against the motion right now. This first vote is open only from now, before the session starts, up until just before the first speaker speaks. That is all the time you have to register your first vote, so please do it now. To come back to the topic, college students should not participate in political protests. Well, there's the story of that one particular student who entered the University of Buenos Aires to study medicine. His hunger to explore the world led him to intersperse his collegiate pursuits with two long introspective journeys that fundamentally changed the way he viewed himself and the contemporary economic conditions of his country and the world. Che Guevara will forever inspire people across the world because of the way he took on the mighty powers of capitalism, no matter how young he was. Surely there's no age bar before you are not allowed to speak up for people. However, we have seen students dabbling in dirty and dangerous politics, armed with weapons and attacking fellow students and teachers simply because they differ on political ideologies. And mind you, this is just not just now, what we've seen in Delhi recently, but violence in student politics has happened forever across the world. Even during my years in Calcutta, in college, a place which gave birth to many, many poignant Indian student protests. So, what is right? To allow or to not allow? That is the question that will be answered tonight. But before we begin, allow me to explain the rules. So, before any of the speakers speak, you need to vote, which is now, so that we find out what you, our viewer, thinks of the motion, which side you agree with. The voting is now live, so you can vote by simply clicking on the link in the description or go on to tatalitlive.in/debate and vote. This is open only for a very short while until just before the first speaker. Shortly thereafter, the results of the first audience vote will be declared by the chair. Then it will be the turn of the speakers to speak. Each member of the panel has 5 minutes to make their argument. There will be a warning sound when there is 60 seconds left and another sound when time is up. The speakers will alternate, starting with the panel for the proposition, followed by the opposition, and so on. Each speaker will be followed up with a specific question by the chair. Post this, all the four speakers will get an opportunity to make a rebuttal in turn for 2 minutes each speaker. For these rebuttals and clarifications, a warning will sound when there are 30 seconds left and another sound when time is up. Post the rebuttals is when the Q&A starts with questions that you, the audience, will have sent us in by typing it in the comment section. This will be read out by me and thrown to the chair on behalf of the audience member. The chair will then decide who to ask the question to if not specified. Midway through this interaction, a second vote will be taken. You will vote again. The chair will sum up the debate, announce the results and the winners. How is the winner decided, you ask? I'll tell you how. The winner is decided by the number of people that have shifted from one point of view to the other. For example, if in the first audience vote, for the motion was 70% and against the motion 30%, and in the second audience vote, for the motion went down to 60% and against the motion went up to 40%, then the winner of the debate is going to be the one against the motion because it gained 10% during the debate, even though the other team had a majority. So the results are entirely based on the number of opinions that the teams managed to move over to their side with their arguments. So don't wait any longer. Quickly register your vote on the link on tatalitlive.in/debate. And now, let me introduce you to the speakers. Speaking for the motion, agreeing that college students should not participate in political protests, is a journalist and author who was educated in South Asian history and politics at Oxford, in business and finance at Columbia University, and in journalism and filmmaking at Jamia Millia Islamia and Delhi University. So I trust that that would have given him ample experience of student life and his trysts with politics. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite Hindol Sengupta to the debate today. Joining him to speak for the motion is the author of The Last Battle of Saraighat, the story of the BJP's rise in the Northeast. Her alma mater, Miranda House, has an interesting development as of March this year. Miranda House is planning to start a 3-month certificate program for training young women interested in joining politics at the state and national levels. I wonder if such a course had been available when she was a student, would this very, very successful political strategist of today have studied it from then itself? We may find out today. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite Shubhra Astha onto the panel. Speaking against the motion that college students should participate in political protests is a lawyer who has studied in Harvard Law School, which was a microcosm of the political rifts of the 60s and 70s. This lawyer has also appeared in court for a student protester who was detained in Karnataka for their protest against CAA. He has written extensively on subjects like the freedom of speech, the judiciary, the Constitution of India, and authored many books as well. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite Abhinav Chandrachur. Joining him to speak against the motion is a woman who is a self-professed soldier for peace, has been trolled viciously for speaking up against the idea of war and its cruelty, has actively participated in student protests, and for her efforts at peace has been lauded by Time magazine as a free speech warrior. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite Gurmehar Kaur for the debate. And chairing this session is one of the pioneers of the Indian news broadcasting industry and the author of the best-selling Super Trilogy, which triangulates the geoeconomics among India, China, and America. Now, being a journalist is all about uncovering both sides of the story, so he's the ideal person to chair tonight's debate. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite Raghav Bahl to the debate. Now, with the introductions done, rules sorted, let the session begin. Over to you, Raghav.
Thank you very much, Ratna. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to what promises to be a very lively, very contentious debate. You know, when I saw the subject, I was transported to my student days, and I'm now talking largely of the 1970s, spilling over a bit into the 80s. And I wondered whether this subject would have been debatable in the 1970s. Because in the 1970s and the 60s before that, but 70s, since I have a lived through experience of the 70s, the fact that student politics and student activism and studies were one organic whole. One led to the other, one sort of interacted, and there was really no separation between the church and state there. Students were always politically active and politically alive, and the proof of the pudding clearly is in the eating, right? I mean, we saw some of the biggest protest movements of the 1960s, 70s, even the 80s, were very largely propelled by student power. In our own country, we of course had the whole Naxal movement, we had the Navnirman movement, we had the student movement of which led by JP, which led to the imposition of emergency. Within the emergency, we had very active student reactions to the imposition of emergency. Across the globe, we of course had the Vietnam protest. We even had the Tiananmen Square protest in China. So, then it was very difficult to say that students should not or could not or would not be part of political protest. But 40 years out since that time, I think some sort of evolutionary change on a rather remarkable scale has happened, and therefore the issue is now debatable. The issue is now contentious. What's happened? Today we are living in a very hyper digital, a very hyper connected, a very hyper competitive, a very sort of a hyper specialized world, very different from the world as it existed in the 70s. And in today's world, you cannot scrub anything that you do. There is, of course, the fundamental argument that students are, financial dependents, and yet they are adults. So they face the full force of any reaction. They face the full force of any of the law, but they're not financially independent. So they're vulnerable. Also, the fact that they are now so much within a digital echo chamber, so much more within a competitive world, that it becomes almost impossible for them, as I said, to leave the past behind. So they are particularly vulnerable. And also, student age is an age of rebellion, right? It's an age of being emotional. While I'm not saying they're not mature, there are life's experiences that you need to go through to become fully mature and to fully understand things in their nuance and their sensitivity. So they are particularly vulnerable to being ideologically indoctrinated, to being becoming cynical, sort of pawns in a cynical power play. So there are arguments now which say that they should perhaps focus on studies and look upon this as a phase of life and a stage of life. And once studies are over, go out into the world and do whatever you want to do as an adult. So there are arguments on both sides. And that, I think, sets us up so nicely for the debate. After all, it is 2021 and no longer the 1970s. And I now understand that the results of the vote are ready. And remember, this is the baseline on which the success of today's debate is going to be decided. So here are the baseline results, and very interesting. It almost sounds like the kind of numbers you get in a presidential debate in the US, or even when you see some close elections in India. For the motion is 47. So there are 47% of the people who are saying that students should not take part in a political protest. And against the motion, 53% are saying students should take part in a political protest. So there is a plus 6 percentage point advantage against the motion. So this is the baseline that we are starting with. And let's see how many people swing at the end of what I believe will be a very energetic, very enlightening, and very exciting debate that our very, very promising young debaters will do. So let's go straight with it. For the motion, coming up first is Hindol Sengupta.
Thank you very much, Raghav. I stand here virtually, though, for the motion. And I want to begin by saying that it is not enough to ask, ladies and gentlemen, whether students should participate in political protests. We must ask the vital second part of the question in such a debate. What kind of political protests are these? What kind of politics is this? Are these grand debates on ideas? Are they competing insights through new novel ways of looking at the world? Or are these even led by students? In the name of students, are we essentially seeing cadres of political parties fight out in our universities? And is that the place where our students are going to get an education? Let me tell you a story, ladies and gentlemen. Roughly about a decade ago, the great Presidency College, the College of Vivekananda and Subhash Chandra Bose, was given the status of a separate university because of its long and illustrious history. It became Presidency University. But alas, ladies and gentlemen, nomenclature does not change everything. In 2012, the Hindu newspaper reported that year after year, violent political protest was out of control in Presidency College / University. Let me quote from that report. A senior police official said they did not, and here we're talking about quote unquote students, they did not even think about the gravity of their offense. And here they were talking about students, quote unquote, going to war with knives and pistols and bombs and what have you. They told us, said the official, it had been happening for the last 20 years, and so they felt they should do it too. Then the report also quoted a senior professor in the physics department who said, in the last 3 years especially, the situation has become unmanageable. There is violence almost every week. This is 2012. In 2017, for the second year running, Presidency College / University could not find enough seats to fill its undergraduate seats in science, in chemistry, and remember which department that professor was from? Physics. 48 seats were available, only 34 could be filled. What is happening, ladies and gentlemen? The so-called political protests are not expanding the minds of our students. Today, they are destroying our campuses in a vicious identity-based ideology which forces people into boxes, demands unquestioning loyalty, and is in fact the very, I put to you, the very opposite of the meaning of education. Education, ladies and gentlemen, is supposed to build a sense of identity. Politics in our campuses takes away from that greatest boon of student life. And in the name of political protest, what we are seeing today is the curtailment of every ability of freedom to dabble, the freedom to mix and match, the freedom to embrace and then discard ideas, the freedom to have opinions and then leave those opinions behind, to make up your own mind. And ladies and gentlemen, far more importantly, to change one's mind. Instead, in the name of political protest, what we have is politics that thrives by not allowing people to speak, being challenged by opinion that one may not agree with, but on canceling people who one disagrees with. And what is the result of all of this, ladies and gentlemen? What is the result of this? For the last several years, only 3 higher education in universities, higher education colleges rank within the top 200 positions in the world university rankings: Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, and Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. What is common, ladies and gentlemen, among these 3? They do not have the curse of what we call rampant political protest. And these are the only 3 universities that find a place and send their students into a world with what they come in demanding and asking for, an education. Year after year, this is the truth. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, I stand here for the motion.
Thank you, Hindol, for wrapping it up completely on time. My question to you, you built a powerful argument, but you built it on a very, very single strong plank, and that is that political protest in universities is toxic, it's violent, it's based on identity politics, it amplifies it, and therefore it takes away from the what a student should be doing. Would you like to consider the fact that some of this protest, all of it is not toxic, all of it is not violent, some of it is also nuanced, sensitive, and therefore are you comfortable with the idea that if we efface all protest from college students, then we will grow up as a very conforming society, people almost robotically just going after material outcomes and not having the sense to deal with the right and wrong or to protest against the right and wrong?
Raghav, I put to you that expansion of one's mind, indeed expansion of one's consciousness, which is what education is truly supposed to provide a human being, does not come from something as superficial as a political protest. It does come, though, from real engagement within the situation that education provides, which is a classroom. It comes from people engaging with books and texts that they may have not had access before. It comes from giving an opportunity to people who may have never had and would have never had that opportunity to engage with ideas and texts that they would have never had access to until they came into that classroom, until they came into that college, into that university. I believe that by using this idea of political protest as something that expands students' minds is completely flawed. As you pointed out, in fact, today it's even worse. These ideas that people pick up in universities and the things that they do and the cancel culture that they learn, they are taking out in the world. So instead of the world expanding, instead of the world becoming more accommodative, we are seeing across the board the world becoming narrower, people becoming more intolerant, people not having had the opportunity to debate out things. If political protest is so potent, Raghav, I put to you, you have been seeing this from 1970s. We have had 30, 40, 50 years of such protests in the world. Would you argue today that India is a place today where more debates can happen, more civil discourse happens? No, it doesn't. In fact, today, the India we live in, actually civil discourse has become almost impossible. The idea of debating with ideas has almost disappeared. We've come into a world of pure cancel culture. And that is the toxicity that this idea of political protest in our universities and colleges has really created for us.
Thank you, Hindol, and I'm glad I don't have to debate with you or to answer that question that you threw at me. I pull my privilege as the chair to ask the first speaker against the motion, Gurmehar, to come in and begin her arguments. Gurmehar, you need to unmute yourself.
So much, Raghav, for inviting me.
Yes.
Lynching, communal violence, police brutality, bills being passed without debates, state attempts to clamp down on freedom of expression, all these are very common sights by now, and these sites are not within university campuses. It is absurd to think that students, a significant subset of voting population, would not be affected enough by political decisions to call them out and demand justice. Be it protests in Hong Kong that shed light on Chinese extradition bill of the 2019 or dissent against the US war in Vietnam, there is ample evidence of student participation resulting in tangible change. Good evening and welcome to what can be considered in multiple democracies a non-debate, and here is why I say so. Politics is just not for people, it's not just for people who are part of political parties and legislatures, but for every single citizen affected by it, and that includes our students. People's lives, liberties, and even aims and futures in part are shaped by the kind of laws they live under. Their ability to freely express themselves, walk safely on the streets, have financial security, etc. If they choose to fight for those essential things through protest with some semblance of change, they should have that choice. So many students get to interact with a diverse set of people once they enter college and are introduced to perspectives so different from ones of their parents, the ones that their parents have conditioned them to see. They view the world through a broader lens, get sensitized to issues they never knew existed, and go through a process of self-discovery and actualization, which often includes shaping their personal beliefs and principles. In a world that students have to now navigate themselves, the state and its ruling become more pertinent than ever in ways that impacts them, their principles, the people of their community. The youth, more than anyone, care about the future and the kind of world they live in and feel obligated to make it more than just a safe space. Believing in causes and standing up for fundamental rights is something they should be able to do collectively. Because student protests can create the kind of unified voice that is hard to ignore or silence easily. The personal is political for numerous students. In that, they want to play an active role in dismantling systematic laws that oppress so many identities. As a Muslim rendered stateless by the CAA and RC bill, or a trans person whose security, privacy, and right to self-determination are violated, or as a person from a family of farmers subjected to state violence, one's very existence is threatened. As students, there are only limited avenues for them to combat injustice, and one of them are protests, and protests that spark possibilities of change. One might say students shouldn't get involved for the fear of safety. Activists exist specifically to lead protests and causes, but where do these activists come from? Most activists start as students who have been personally affected by discriminatory laws or empathize with marginalized and galvanized, marginalized and are galvanized into social welfare because they care about making a country a better place to live in. Some of the current crop of top leaders have been student protesters against decisions like the emergency. Participating in political protest is a choice students make, knowing the potential risks that come with it, depending on the sort of state they live in. They can choose that sacrifice if they believe it leads to bigger outcomes like larger public support and mobilization for the cause. It is their trade-off to make. When you When you know your issue is urgent, laws are cutting away at you and your fellow citizens' freedom, security in the country, there needs to be someone who can challenge unjustified acts, fascist measures, and puppet media coverage. If students don't raise their voices about important policy and constitutional issues, who will? And how many other ways are available to them? The power of mass protest and participation is immense. It garners international media and raises awareness. The kind of resources and attention one can mobilize through protest is one of the ways many can create significant narrative shifts and obtain political consciousness. A big example of this is in 2019, very recent student protests in Chile over a subway fare hike morphed into a nationwide call for socioeconomic equality and better social services that brought millions to the street and forced the president to increase benefits for the disadvantaged and start a process of constitutional reforms. University students. There is still more time. Well, university students have found a safe space in campus protest to work and act on their constitutional rights, and that needs to be protected.
That's your 5 minutes up, Gurmehar. Now, my question to you is that you made a very compelling and a very strong case, but you focused almost entirely on a positive outcome, where a positive, healthy protest against excesses in society leads to positive change. You focused on that. That's a very important part of the argument to focus on. What about what Hindol was talking about? He was talking about cancel culture. He was talking about a perversion of the political process, which his argument was, well, that's the pervasive reality, not the healthy protest that you talked about. And therefore, students should be actually getting their sensitization and their evolution as adults, as thinking adults, through the process of knowledge and discovery and books, and that is the positive process and not the protest. How do you handle that?
I mean, that's a very patronizing argument to start with. And talking about violence, I started off my debate mentioning the lynchings, mentioning the violence we have seen in the recent past. And like I said, all these, all of the instances of violence that I mentioned are not ones taking place in a student campus. In fact, there have been 693 incidents, 11 deaths during the 2019 Lok Sabha polls. So what do we do now? Do we stop the polls? Or do we create frameworks? Do we create effective frameworks to make sure that students, citizens can exercise on their political constitutional rights? And that is my question and my answer to Hindol's argument.
Anything more you would like to add? You do have some more time. You have about a minute to go.
Well, I've got a lot of time, but I've said what I had to say.
All right. Good. So Gurmehar concludes her argument, and we've had one speaker each now who's gone for and against the motion. And now coming up is Shubhrasta. She will be making a case for the motion, that is, students should not be protesting.
Thank you, Raghav, for including me in this really interesting session. I think we are going by whatever I heard from Hindol and Gurmehar. I think there needs to be a demarcation between activism and protest. And I think somehow we have been able to very successfully muddle the difference between the two and make activism seem like protest and protest seem like activism. Now, with all due respect to Gurmehar's sincerity, the arguments that she made is a perfect example of why student protest should not be allowed. She ended up saying that Indian Muslims have been, disenfranchised by CA and NRC as if they don't have citizenship anymore. That's not correct. A very small bill of not even, it's half a page bill. If Gurmehar would have managed to read the bill properly without getting into that intellectual hegemonic atmospherics of the English department, Delhi University, and managed to read for herself, as Hindol was saying, going back to the text, going back to history, looking, doing her own research, she would not have fallen into this classic Indian liberal trap. Point number one. Point number two, We keep quoting Dr. Ambedkar every now and then. It's important to revisit what Dr. Ambedkar had to say in the Constituent Assembly, the last speech that he made, where he spoke about grammar of anarchy, where he spoke about life of contradictions when he was discussing social democracy. And I think it is here that I want to make my the main argument against main argument for this motion. It's important for us to understand that in a democracy, when we use words like protest and when we use words like dissent and we romanticize this entire quote unquote students movement, we take away the essence of what is actually at hand. That is a philosophical, theological arguments behind whatever is going on. It's interesting and very, sexy to talk about lynchings without understanding and without actually looking up into data to see which state actually passed the first anti-lynching law in India. And what was the team that, behind that, famous legislation? It was an extremely young cabinet with an extremely young legislative, body which actually passed laws. Gurmehar made it seem as if everything in India is not right. Lawmakers are making, laws out of some random machinations, and that's not true, Gurmehar. There is an electoral process in place. People go to, in fact, everybody kept quoting JP prior to this. Let me tell you, JP also initiated a movement, and all the leaders from JP movement had a very democratically, they had a very democratic sail through. But my fundamental question, Raghav, and I think I'm going to stir up a lot of controversies by saying this. My point is whether it is JP movement or the aftermath of JP movement, what kind of leaders did we get? It was fine to protest against Indira Gandhi. It was fine to oust her out of power. But at the end of the day, what were the policy initiatives that were taken after asking Indira Gandhi to leave? I think today in India, we need to discuss this. It's not about representation anymore. It's about quality of representation. With the advent of social media, it's very easy to broadcast your points of view and opinion without anybody trying to trample down on your freedom of expression. If you're bold enough to take up criticisms your way and handle it with panache, I don't think people lynch you for merely airing your views. Yeah, you can be, of course, put behind bars if you paint a particular chief minister in a particular way, but I'll leave those jibes for political discussions, primetime political discussions. There was a parental conditioning. I think I still have some time to go. There was some talk about parental conditioning, Raghav. Let me tell you, in campuses that I have been, a campus that I have been part of, there is a deep-seated intellectual conditioning as well. And I think students need to be given enough time and leeway not to understand the merits and demerits of both these kinds of conditioning, parental or intellectual, hegemonic, dictatorial conditioning in college campuses, especially if a student walks up, to the alleys of Delhi University or Jawaharlal Nehru University or, all elite college campuses which are infamous or famous for protests, they need to understand that there are students not only coming down to, taking a metro from Vasant Vihar to Delhi University. There are students who come from Nevada, who come from Chikmagalur, and all of them have a very different intellectual exposure prior to, going and hitting the ground. So, and when I'm talking,
we've come to the end of your 5 minutes. Of course, you have 2 more, and you can dilate a bit. But I just wanted to, the argument that you put forth had two sort of equal measures in it. One was obviously the topic that we have, which is students taking part in political protest. But then you brought in a very strong element of contemporary politics into it. Nothing wrong with it, and you brought in an element of the liberal versus conservative debate, which is at the heart of a student political protest. There are liberals and there are conservatives, and they are even more sharply delineated. I just want to drag you back to a very interesting point that you made right at the beginning of activism getting confused with protest. Activism being seen as protest and protest being seen as activism. I'd love to understand that a little bit more, maybe with the contemporary examples, because you've used contemporary examples so much in your arguments.
Yes, I think Hindol touched upon this when he talked about this, I think he touched upon the question of employability a little. And let me, I have been a student of liberal arts. I studied English honors from Miranda, went on to do my master's as well. But after my master's, I was completely clueless in in the professional world. I did not have any relation with reality. It's only when I started working at the Hindu that I understood that the world works in a completely different way. It is not as Machiavellian, and it is not as romantic as the English department made it seem, and as the English texts made it seem. And why do I bring this reference, Raghav, is because if in my college days I was exposed to maybe a compulsory training of sorts on which I was marked. Maybe instead of reading about Karl Marx and class struggle, I was actually sent to the jungles of Dandakaranya to understand how the Gandhian groups, the Sangha Parivar, and the Maoists sometimes work together to bring sanity in the lives of tribals. I think that would have made more sense. But to hear on and on from professors of a particular leaning talk about Dandakaranya in a particular way completely hegemonized my point of view, and it took me a decade of unlearning thanks to my the kind of work that I managed to get into through political consultancy, activism, and all of that, without actually being a part of a political setup or party as such, that I was able to make that difference. So I think that's what I was hinting at.
Interesting. That's an interesting nuance you've introduced into the debate, essentially of activism as distinct from protest, while they all obviously converge at several points. Well, the final speaker for who's going against the motion, Abhinav Chandrachur. Abhinav, take it away.
So thank you, Raghav. I'd like everyone to pay close attention to the proposition which we're debating today. The proposition is college students should not participate in political protests. Now, when you read this proposition, you realize at once that the proposition is far too broad to be accepted. For instance, what form of protests are we talking about? Naturally, I'm sure we'd all agree with Hindol that violence should not be condoned by anyone. No student should participate in a violent protest. No student should incite violence. No student should indulge in hate speech, incite the commission of an offense. But why non-violent protests? Secondly, there are various kinds of political protest. Wearing a black band on your arm can be a form of a political protest. Reciting poetry on a college campus can be a form of a political protest. Wearing a t-shirt that contains a political message can be a form of protest. Painting a picture, art can be a form of political protest. For instance, the works of Banksy's and Banksy's subversive images. Why only political protest? So are you meaning to say that a college student can protest the rise in petrol prices because this would be an economic protest? That a college student can protest caste-based discrimination because this would be a social protest, but not protest a law proposed to be enacted by Parliament because this would be a political protest? Why is it that students should only not be permitted to participate in protests, but not in other kinds of demonstrations? So if I'm a college student and I decide to hold a demonstration to support a law that is being enacted by Parliament, am I permitted to do it merely because it's not a protest? Then why are we talking about all college students? Where I come from in Mumbai, college starts very often after standard 10. Now one can understand if you want to exclude those who are not adults from participating in protests without the consent of their guardians or parents at least. But why adults? Why do you want to prevent adults from participating in political protests? Adult college students can vote, they can drive a car, they can enter into contracts, they can get married, they can, in many states above a certain age, drink alcohol, but they can't participate in political protests. That doesn't make much sense. And why all college students? This includes not merely undergraduate students, but also graduate students, postgraduate students. Many postgraduate students may have taken up a doctoral degree after some practical experience. You're including all students, painting everyone with the same brush. And why only college students? So do you mean to say that a person who has a high school diploma but chooses not to go to college can protest? Do you mean to say that somebody who's in high school who has not yet entered college should participate in political protests? So it's okay for Greta Thunberg, for example, a high school student who began her activism at the age of 15, sitting outside the Swedish parliament, to protest merely because she's not a college student. But it's not okay for a college student to do so merely because that student is in college. Well, I find it quite interesting and some of the members who spoke for the proposition, I think, hinted at this, that well, students are going to college for the purposes of studying, and that's what they should do. Now, I find this to be quite an interesting and quite an amazing argument. Students should only study. If that proposition is correct, then wouldn't it be correct to say that cricketers should only play cricket, workers in factories should only work in factories, farmers should only till the land? That argument would lead us down a very dangerous, slippery slope, because then nobody would have the right to protest remaining. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't believe being a protester is a career choice. So everyone would have a career, and no person who has a career would be entitled to protest. Can it be said that lawyers should only be engaged in the practice of law and not get into allied fields? If that were so, then we would not have a freedom movement, because most of the leaders of India during the colonial period, leaders like Gandhi, Nehru, and Patel, were lawyers. And don't we want to encourage our students to think critically on college campuses, or do we only want them to engage in the conventional wisdom? Now, you have heard some of the counter arguments that have been made today. One of the counter arguments is that, well, students could end up going to jail if they participate in political protests. To that I say, not all form of protest can land you up in jail. Wearing a black band on your arm would not certainly land you up in jail. Reciting poetry on a college campus would not land you up in jail. And this is not only applicable to students. What will happen to India's democracy if everyone starts fearing that they are going to get arrested? If everyone is going to be afraid that they're going to jail, who will oppose an oppressive regime, assuming that there is one? I'm not saying that there necessarily is one. Then you have the argument that, well, college students aren't mature. I've already touched on this. If college students who are above the age of 18 can vote, enter into a contract, get married, drink alcohol, then why, pray, are they not mature enough to protest? Thank you.
Thank you, Abhinav. In true lawyerly style, you did focus in a very micro way on the language of on the construction of the proposition. By training, you're required to look at the language of the statute, because that's where you find the argument. So you really demolished the word college. I must because really, why college students? Why not students? So I think you attacked that pretty strongly. I just want to something that you sort of mixed up a couple of issues. So I just want clarity in my head. Lawyers are professionals, and cricketers are professional. They've gone beyond their student days, most of them. We are talking here about students, student cricketers, student lawyers, student actors, whatever. Is it therefore your argument that they would have the maturity even in their student days to face the flack that would inevitably follow, in the digital echo chamber that we today live in? I mean, if today you have an FIR against you as a student, that black mark survives on Wikipedia, on Twitter, on all sort of social media forever and ever. And while you may not have the full maturity at this stage to understand, as a practicing lawyer, you understand all of those things. So did you give enough focus to the age and the maturity spectrum in your argument?
So thank you, Raghav, for that question. And that's a very interesting question. And the reason I spoke about the fact that the proposition seems to be too broad is because look at the way it's drafted. We're talking about all college students across the spectrum. So when you speak of maturity, I don't think it would be possible to argue that an undergraduate student just straight out of high school would necessarily have, I'm not saying that that's always true, would necessarily have the same level of maturity as, say, somebody who's in the final year of a doctoral program about to defend his or her doctoral thesis. So maturity can be of different levels. I'm not saying that age and maturity, this is by the way, a common misconception in India, even in the legal profession, that age is somehow tied to maturity. I know plenty of immature 40-year-olds, and I know plenty of precocious and very highly mature 18-year-olds. So I don't subscribe to the proposition that age and maturity are necessarily linked. But if you believe that they might be, then why, pray, would you paint both undergraduate students and postgraduate students really with the same brush? So that's really the first part of my answer to your question. The second part of my answer to your question is, well, you raise a very interesting point. You say, if an FIR is registered against you, that's a black mark against you that will last for the rest of your life, unless, of course, you are acquitted in the case, unless, of course, the case is quashed, so on and so forth. But really, this is something that then speaks to a weakness in our democratic system, Because does this not therefore mean that every person, not only a college student, should fear arrest? Because if I'm a lawyer, if I'm a doctor, if I'm an honest person who has a job in a business consulting firm, if I have my own business, I'm a small businessman, I run a micro, small and medium industry, should I not be afraid of protesting the government's illegal actions or oppressive actions on the ground that an FIR may be registered against me, and rather than attending to my professional calling or my occupational calling, I will then have to really seek legal advice, keep going to the court? So who will then be left to stand to protest when something goes wrong, when there actually is something that's oppressive that takes place?
Well, thank you, Abhinav. You brought in a very interesting argument which wasn't there in the earlier part of the debate, that we are students as much as adults, mature professionals, are part of a democratic polity, are part of an institutional framework. And if that institutional framework is somewhat weak or somewhat flawed, then it's as weak and as flawed for the student as for the mature professional, right? Good point to get into the rebuttals, and we're going to go back into the sequence that we began with. So Hindol, take it away. 2 minutes.
My very first point, if indeed the logic is that a student is many things apart from a student, then the student can surely protest elsewhere. The proposition today is about the student protesting within the precincts of a college. There is no problem in the student protesting in their bathroom or in their neighborhood street, in their locality, at the bus stand. They could do it elsewhere. The point is, when you actually do it within the precincts of an educational institution, you hurt the prospects not only often of yourself, but many others who study there. And since Abhinav is a lawyer, he would know that it is because of this reason that in numerous judgments, the Kerala High Court has pointed exactly this out when it was challenged that educational institutions and colleges cannot prevent such protests from happening, cannot prevent such political protests from happening. This is the exact reason. And as far as Gurmehar's point about, violence happens in polls, well, we are talking about the practice of democracy, the actual voting. And it is because we don't allow violence at that point when people are voting. We have thousands and thousands of policemen guarding the entire process so that people can practice the act of democracy. Colleges and institutions are places where people practice the act of gaining knowledge, and therefore that's what they should be used for. Also, this very interesting point that, at the end of the day, students learn something by this entire process. They should be able to, practice these political protests. But what are these protests all about? Often these protests are about political parties and their cadre at the grassroots level, leading this entire process, stopping the education of hundreds of others who would have actually gained by that education. That is the fundamental problem.
Thank you, Hindol, and let's keep the rebuttals quick fire. So let's get Gurmehar in straight away. 2 minutes.
Suppose Shubrashta and Hindol have painted this lovely picture, well, not so lovely for me, that all the protests are violent and there's a certain, and Shubrashta has given all student protesters this very interesting sort of phase, the Miranda House, English Lit, idealist. But, protests go way back and are part of the reason, and, are a part of the reason we live in a free democracy. In line with democratic principles, any citizen should, at any given point, have the freedom to ascribe to and participate in their preferred kind of politics, through various platforms, like Abhinav said, speeches, protests, writings, poems, as long as there is no violence involved. And in fact, there is someone, there's someone who is not a career politician, not a protester, who I want to talk about briefly. I don't know if you've heard of the Praja Mandal movement in Junagadh. So the people of Junagadh for a very long time had been demanding a popular representation and constitutional reforms in the state. The Praja Mandal agitation, became very vigorous after India gave independence, and the Nawab there unleashed a reign of terror to crush popular protest. There was a man, his name is Dhirubhai Ambani, still in his teens, plunged into the movement, rallying a team of students to write patriotic slogans on the town walls in dark of the night. He designed and painted and scribbled these posters in secret hideouts, carried banners, carried banned newspapers like Janmabhoomi, and hidden under his t-shirts. And as the popular movement became impossible to crush. Soon after 12th November 1947, Junagadh joined the Indian Union because the Nawab one night secretly fled to Pakistan because of how powerful that movement was. And part of and here's to come back, coming back from here. Part of the reason that people oppose student participation in public and public defense.
Gurmehar, you've run out of your time, but you did quote an extremely unusual example. I mean, you live and learn new things every day. I didn't know Dhirubhai Ambani was such a student activist. Well,
big fan of Sardar Patel. I'm sure Hindol would know.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I live and learn new things every day. Shubrasta, over to you. 2 minutes. You have to unmute yourself, please. You're muted.
When a professor who happens to be a woman is stopped from taking classes, is holed up in a classroom and not even allowed to use a washroom, surely that doesn't account for student protest. That's absolute gundaism and hooliganism. Whereas when college students, and as a fellow panelist, Mr. Chandrachur, actually pointed out really well, when students from Dharhara village in Bihar take up the cause of female infanticide and actually plant every with the birth of a girl child, a plant has been planted in Dharhara for a very long time now, and it's one of the greenest villages in Bihar today. That is protest and activism for me. For me, I'm sorry, but we are getting into this very elite trap of talking about student protest from the vantage point of a few universities. Of course, I quoted the English department, but it was not only Miranda, it also stands for LSR, the English department generally of Delhi University, Gurmehar. And I think you should know that it's the Bhadralok, Bengali dominated English department of Delhi University, from which I've studied, is my vantage point of talking about college politics. So I'm not going to talk about what happened when Dhirubhai Ambani went to college, when Arun Jaitley ji went to college, because the atmosphere was very, different back then. I talked about the JP movement, and I still ask this question, and I would like to open it to the audience. Actually, please tell me one policy initiative that was taken to Indira Gandhi's politics. Because if it was not, then what was the point of these student protests at the end of the day?
Okay, so we have Shubrasta ending her rebuttal with that question, which I'm sure she's asked the audience to ask. So I'm sure some people in the audience must be framing that for her and for the other panelists. Last rebuttal, over to Abhinav.
Thank you, Raghav. So I think let me begin with a very interesting argument that was made by Hindol. During his opening statement, Hindol said that, well, 3% of colleges in India rank at the very top. And the thing that these 3% colleges, I don't know if he said 3 colleges or 3% of the colleges that they have in common, is that they ban student protests. And I think this takes us down a very interesting trap. And I can encapsulate that trap in a sentence, which is correlation is not causation. It's a pretty famous statistical saying. And let me explain what that means to the uninitiated. Because I wake up every morning, the sun also rises. Does that mean that the sun rises because I'm waking up every morning? Surely that can't be true. Merely because two things are correlated, they occur at the same time, does not mean that one of them is causing the other. Now, merely because 3% of India's colleges ban protests, student protests, and that 3% is also at the top of the Indian educational system, does not necessarily mean that they are at the top because they ban those protests. There may be a host of other factors that have not been taken into account. So I think this is a fallacious statistical argument. The second thing that I'd like to say in response to what Hindol said is that, well, Hindol said that we're talking about students protesting within the precincts of a college. I would urge Hindol to read the proposition once again a little carefully. The proposition is college students should not participate in political protests, period, whether those protests are taking place within the precincts of the college or outside the precincts of the college. So I think Hindol would join me in accepting the proposition that college students can participate in political protests so long as they are taking place outside of college campuses. I think I really don't have anything to say in opposition to what Shubrasta said. I think she said that, well, her education in some respects did not train her for the real world. I wholeheartedly support that. Even my legal education in Mumbai didn't really train me practically for the world of being an actual lawyer, but I don't think that has much to do with the debate or the proposition at hand.
Thank you, debaters. You've been very disciplined about the time, so I'm truly delighted that I didn't have to use the sort of hard coming down hard on anyone who was trying to steal time away from which wasn't theirs. So we're ready for our audience to begin posing questions to us, and I'm sure there will be a ton of things that people have who would like to ask our debaters, and let's get straight in. So over to Ratna.
Yes, we do have a lot of questions coming in. The first one is from Usha Subramaniam. Can one silence debates because they're no longer civil? So who would you like this question to be answered by?
Now I am tempted to give this to Hindol, but no, I'll give it to Shubhrasta to answer this question.
May I listen to the question once again, the exact framing of the question?
Yes, it is, can one silence debates because they're no longer civil?
No, we can't. And even if, college and universities come up with these rules and regulations, you can't, block people from going on social media and venting. The world has changed remarkably, and the world has changed in ways that with post-COVID things becoming, offices have gotten online, people's celebrations have gotten online. So of course we can't, silence voices, even if there are injunctions and laws in place, you can't. If all of us recall, it was during the UPA era that the first slew of rules and regulations came with respect to, regulating free speech. But did free speech get regulated? No. At the end of the day, we might, beyond the pressings of this debate also, we might disagree with each other vociferously on many counts, but we all have our own platforms and our own avenues through which we go forward and put forward our views. So I think we can't, we should not, and it will not happen.
Interesting. The reason I gave it to Shubhrasta was because Hindol had constructed such a powerful argument, and he would have ended up reinforcing that. So I wanted to go to his colleague on the proposition and hear her thoughts on the argument her colleague created. The next question, please, Ratna.
Yes, but before the second question, I would like to now declare the second vote to be open. This is where you, the audience, you let us know what you think of the topic now that you've heard our speakers put forth their arguments. So just click on the description, on the link in the description, and vote immediately, because the voting will remain open only for 15 minutes. So just 15 minutes, so quickly vote right away. So carrying on with the question and answer session, there is a question by Ravi Ramchandra, and he's directed it to Abhinav. He's saying, you said that there can be peaceful protests, not necessarily violent, but how can you stop a protest from becoming violent?
Well, if the protest becomes... Yeah. Well, if a protest becomes violent, I'm sure that the police have their techniques of ensuring that a protest that becomes violent will have to be restrained. The leaders of the protest will have to be really brought to book, and there are tools that the police have at their disposal in order to ensure that a protest that is peaceful does not turn into a violent protest. Of course, if we look back at history, we have the great example of the freedom movement, which was a non-violent movement, and it turned violent in one respect, and the leader of the movement called off the entire freedom movement. So there are ways for the leaders of peaceful protests to ensure that the protests stay peaceful, and there are ways for the administration to ensure that peaceful protests don't turn into violent protests.
All right, Ratna, next one.
Yes. The next one is by Shahana Shah, who has pointed this to Gurmehar, asking, why should taxpayer money be used to protect students when it is already being used to educate them?
I always find this statement kind of vague, and it's a blanket statement, right? When we say taxpayer, who are the taxpayers, right? Are these students protesting not taxpayers? Are their parents not taxpayers? When we go and buy a little packet of chips and the little tax that goes in it, are we not already a part of this economic system? So yeah, it's a very vague, redundant question, and that's all I have to say. How do you even define taxpayers? We often define in this imagination, within this sort of framework, the imagination is a taxpayer is this man in a suit who goes to work and isn't a student. But you know what? When I go to a restaurant and I eat my food, I'm paying my tax. And you know what? Since I've paid my tax, I also want to protest. And that's all I have to say in response to it. I can pay my tax and protest. I have the right to do it, and I'm going to do it.
Okay, Ratna, interesting.
Yeah. All right. The next question is from Ratna Das, and she asks, how do the speakers for the motion hope to stop students or young people protesting or even thinking?
Right, Hindol, you take this one away.
We don't want to stop anybody from doing anything. We do have a very powerful case, though, that the proposition clearly says college students. I mean, I've tried to change that by saying, well, it doesn't say college at the end. Well, it does define them as college students inside a college. Otherwise, they would have just said students. We do have a strong point that as college students in an educational institution, they must focus on the education. And we keep moving on from this point. The Kerala High Court, in judgment after judgment, has pointed out that colleges, because of the nature of this political activity, have the right to stop this kind of activity. And we are not talking about activity here which talks about a black band on your shirt. We are obviously not talking about that. That's a very romanticized idea. We are talking about political protests in our country which use weapons, which use bombs, which become violent, which destroy lives not only for the people who are conducting this protest, but also for hundreds of others who actually would have perhaps gone through great difficulty to get access to that education. Education is fundamentally very valuable, and we cannot allow the political cadre of political parties to fight it out in colleges, which is exactly what happens, and destroy that valuable education for many people. We have to stick to the reality rather than a romanticized dream.
All right, so all of our panelists have had one question each. Let's go ahead.
Okay, the next question is from Chandita Mukherjee, and she asks, teaching students to conform means that we never teach them how to question status quo. How can we then expect them to push the envelope on science, technology, innovation, and new thought?
Okay, since this is questioning the stand taken by the people for the proposition, and Hindol just had a big say, over to Shubrasta again.
Yes. Look, I don't think any one of us are, advocating for students not being allowed to think, not being allowed to take up issues. The problem that we have all underscored and underlined is in context of the recent protests that have created quote unquote student leaders who fought elections and lost deposits. That's the context in which this debate is. That's how I chose to interpret the debate. I don't want to take this debate, in an airy atmosphere where we only discuss about philosophical, genesis of all of this. On this debate also, when the question was raised on NRC and CAA, and a fellow student who was in campus, and perhaps then only the CAA NRC bill came out, this is a live example of what happens when students go out, hit the ground, instigated by the ideological mentors that they have in campuses, without having a basic knowledge of the draft. Here is Mr. Chandrachur. Let me ask him. He is a lawyer. Mr. Chandrachur, does the CAA or NRC ever say that Indian Muslims would be disenfranchised or they would be, pushed out of the country? But that's a very popular proposition that was brought in, by student protesters. And why was it brought in? Because the faculty members, if you look at the, if you look at the political the history of their political views, you would get to know which side of the aisle they stand from. We have a problem. I think Hindol and I have a problem with this kind of ideological barricading, with this kind of ideological hegemonical positions that certain universities have had, and these certain universities sort of dictate the entire narrative of student politics in India. I also talked about Dharhara village. Why is nobody talking about that? There are environmental activists out there who do not get the kind of network like Greta Thunberg does. But then there are Sorry, yeah.
Subrata, all right. I think you answered the first part of the question. Then you've thrown a little challenge at Abhinav. Can we break format a bit and get Abhinav to quickly respond rather than leave it hanging in the air and then go for the question? So Abhinav.
Okay, sure. So Shubrasta has asked me about the CAA NRC, and I don't think I can answer that question in anything less than an hour, but I would like to plug a paper that I've written on the CAA NRC. It's available on the Social Science Research Network. It's available for free. So if you're interested in the topic, I have written about this, and you can download the paper.
All right. Okay.
And Raghav, since you're breaking format, since the point about Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel was thrown at me by Gurmehar, I deserve 30 seconds to answer that, with your permission.
All right. We're having a debate within a debate. It's fine. It's all right.
Wonderful. Since the point about Dhirubhai Ambani was brought in, well, anybody who knows the history of Junagadh and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel in Junagadh would know that Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel used the most strongest measures possible to stop a particular kind of political activity which was antithetical to India's interest. In fact, it was Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel who told communist student protesters, so to speak, that really most of the things that they were demanding even before India got independence were absolutely worthless, because fundamentally, the country had to get into independence first. So if we are debating history, we should keep
30 seconds up. And just to be fair, I think Gurmehar only said that I'm talking about Sardar Patel and Hindol would know it. So I don't want to go into newer debates here, but interesting. Stay charged, stay excited. It's always good to have very energetic points of view. Ratna, let's get back to our audience and what they're asking.
Yes, there's a question from Simran Mendon again for Shubhra Astha. This is asking, is Shubhra Astha implying that protests must lead to policy creation by the protesters?
If the protest is against a particular policy pushed by a democratically elected government, and if they do not have an alternative in place, if they do not have alternative policy suggestions in place, then according to me, it's a failed protest or a politically or a motivated protest to destabilize democracy. I would call it something that Dr. Ambedkar talked about, that is grammar of anarchy, and I think I would rest my case at that. If there are Sorry, yeah.
No. I just wanted to move quicker and be able to get more questions in, because I think you did answer that in your assertions as well as in the answer. Ratna, next question.
Yes, this is from Sujata Vemuri asking, how can I encourage my children to make their voices and opinions heard without resorting to political protests?
Okay, interesting. So without resorting to political protest, can I get them to have a political mind? Gurmehar, you want to have a shot at that?
Why not? You don't have to go on a protest. Why not? Why don't you write? You could write a blog, you could write an article, you could write a tweet, you could write an Instagram post, you could write a poem, you could sing a poem, you could sing a song, you could create a band. There's so many beautiful, wonderful ways of protesting that is not just on campus protests. I know throughout this debate, there's this picture of college students protesting, with bombs and weapons. But you know what? Most of us, if you ask an actual student protester very recently out of university, had been protesting for a long time, we mostly just sing songs, chant, write on our Facebooks, have our Instagrams, and that's the joy of it. There's so many multiple ways of protesting, and it's always nice to look at the brighter, interesting, engaging side of it. And I think young people across the world, especially in this country, 60% of us in a country of 1.25 billion people are under the age of 25. It's a very strong voice, and the collective should come together, work towards
protest. Is there a real distinction? What kind of a distinction exists? Would Would you do that for us?
Well, sure, there is. I mean, activism, when the word activism is thrown up at me, the best kind of activism I can think of is judicial activism. And you don't have to protest as a judge in order to engage in judicial activism. By judicial activism, you mean that, well, you stretch the boundaries of the law to make things possible that were not possible before. So the greatest example of this was after the emergency, where the courts really allowed people to file public interest litigations, or what we now know as public interest litigation. And you can really be an activist. You can be an RTI activist without really protesting, right? You need not go out onto the streets. You need not protest anything, but you can file an RTI application under the Right to Information Act. You can find out about what the government can ensure that the government is spending its money correctly. You can file a petition in the High Court or in the Supreme Court in terms of a public interest petition, and you can be an activist in that manner. And at the same time, you need not necessarily protest because you're within the system. You're not protesting against the system.
Interesting. Yes, that I think this whole debate has addressed this issue quite clearly now. Activism versus protest, or activism and protest. Ratna, please, can you get the next question?
The next question is directed to Gurmehar. It's from Ashini, asking, will you not agree that students do put themselves at risk when they protest? For instance, students in Hong Kong have been arrested. So even if you think that they have the right to protest, is it sensible to do so if you risk being arrested and ruining your future?
I think, when we talk about students, why are we thinking of them as, when we talk about students, why are we thinking of them as children? Students are 18 years old. They believe in something. They want to fight for something. They want to stand for something. And they are thinking people. If they can vote for between two political parties, they can very well make a choice for themselves where they are like, well, you know what? I'm going to say this. This might get me in trouble. This might get me, this might get me charged under UAPA. But I'm going to continue to, I'm going to continue to speak for what I believe in, and that's a trade-off they make. But the real question is not, well, should students, should students put themselves at risk? The real question is, why is there a risk? In a democracy, why is there a risk for a student to say what they want to say? Why is it that students, when they post statuses on Facebook or walk, with a Kala Jhanda in front of the Home Minister's car in UP as a way of protest, are put into jail? The question is not of whether the question is not, should we make the choice? The question is, why do we have to make a choice in a free country?
All right. So I think this whole point of the importance of an institutional framework, and if the institutional framework is benign, then possibly protests are more legitimate for any student to adopt or to indulge in. Is an argument that's been made. I'm not on either side of the argument, but I think the point of institutional framework is an important one. Ratna, next question.
Yes, this is from Divyansh Gautam, and he has pointed it to Abhinav and Gurmehar. Do we have a resource or books that map student protests through history in India and the world, necessary to keep the knowledge alive?
All right. Do you want to take a choice between the two of you? Who wants to go first, or maybe just one of you? Abhinav, you want to go because Gurmehar just finished an argument?
Sure, yeah. So I have to be candid. I mean, I'm not aware of any book that maps the history of student protests. I mean, there are plenty of great books on freedom of speech and expression. There's a great book written by Gautam Bhatia, Offend, Shock and Disturb, which will give you a lay of the land on the arguments that are made in terms of the free speech regime in the country. But I have to be candid. I don't know about any book that maps the historical context of student protest in the world. No.
There is a book that I was just about to begin reading, and because I have terrible memory, I can't quite remember the name. But there is a book, and it basically charts. Ho Chi Minh's entire political journey and sort of the it's called Underground Asia. The book is called Underground Asia. Yes.
All right. Underground Asia. So
if you're looking for books on protest, you'll find a lot about Subhash Chandra Bose as a young protester and the little underground connections between one student protest and another. It's a very interesting book.
Interesting. So you have a definitely. Next question.
Yes, I will just, sorry, I'm scrolling up and down. Here we go.
Ratna, we
Veda
could also
Bharati.
make this the last question, if that's okay with you.
Fair enough, of course. So Veda Bharati has asked, do students really have a good understanding of the history and politics to take a stand, especially when we believe that even the history books that we study are biased?
Okay, in all fairness, to balance things out, the quick answers from Hindol, followed by Shubhrasta, because that'll balance it out. Hindol?
That's the entire point. An education is supposed to teach people how to think, to open their eyes and their minds and their hearts. And it doesn't matter if students choose to, or anybody chooses to fly flags outside any politician's car in any state of India. The moot point here is to keep the educational space sacrosanct. That's the
All
moot
right.
point. And we
Yes,
should stick to that point.
Can I take 60 seconds to answer that?
moot point has been made so forcefully by Hindol in every argument that he's preferred. Okay, last word, Shubhrasta, and then we can get to the results because they are ready.
See, there's a pointed question being asked about whether our history has been biased or not. Of course it has been. Otherwise, we would have all, when we heard and read about Indira Gandhi, we would also have read about Tarkeshwari Sinha. Tarkeshwari Sinha, interestingly, comes from Bihar, from Nalanda. An MP who happened to be a woman who went to London School of Economics on full scholarship, studied there, took a decision to come back to India, serve her motherland way back in 1930s. That was a very big thing. But none of us even know about Tarkeshwari Sinha. I don't, despite the fact that I come from her land in Bihar. I would want to say that she is my political ancestor that way. But I don't know about her. So of course this question, I think and this is not just about one. This is not just about one Tarkeshwari Sinha. There is a Dakshayani Velayudhan who stood up in the Constituent Assembly debates.
So, Shubhrasta, I'm just cutting you in because before we get to the results, we are giving all our speakers one final wrap-up comment, 1 minute each, and we'll go in the order in which we started. So, Hindol, you have exactly 1 minute for your final comments.
Thank you, Raghav.
One second.
Are we ready? Okay, Hindol, go.
Thank you, Raghav. In this 1 minute, the only thing that needs to be underlined again and again is that we are debating whether educational institutions, colleges themselves, should be used for quote unquote political protests that are so venal, so violent that no less than the Kerala High Court has passed judgment saying that universities and colleges deserve the right to stop this kind of activity. We are not talking about black bands being flown. We are not talking about Twitter messages. We are not talking about poems being written. We are talking about the political protests that plague most of our universities. And the point about only 3 or 4 universities consistently, year after year, popping up in the top 200 colleges, we have to ask ourselves if we can afford more disruption to education, where not a single university, even today, actually from India even pops up in the top 100 list. We have 4 and all 4 of them are technical universities, right, which most of them are free from this plague. We have to create better education spaces.
Thank you, Hindol. We are going to be somewhat approximate in this 1 minute here, but we all know what 1 minute looks like, right? Gurmehar, go.
Part of the reason that people and Hindol and Shubhrasta oppose student participation in public dissent is out of concern for student safety. But the question is, why does this fear of arrest or charges arise in the first place when non-violent protests are perfectly constitutional? Violence is condemnable. And it is important that students ensure that protest remains non-violent under all circumstances. But it is even more important for the state to be non-violent as well. And the students should be able to oppose state actions that cross this line in any form. In India, the frequency and list of reasons for slamming charges on student activists have grown alarmingly under the BJP routine. It is the state that has tainted student protest as subversion, and crack down on the so-called anti-national participants, making it increasingly risky to publicly question and denounce political bills and actions. To those who argue that protest participation detracts from actual
all right. So approximately 1 minute is up, and we have gotten back into a more contemporary political debate, and I'm sure Shubhrasta just loves it, but you only have 1 minute.
Right. Look, I'm not going to, contemporize it a little, a lot more. I would just say that in order for students to understand really what nationalism is beyond the precincts of what their professors teach, it's important for them to hit the ground and understand nationalism from the point of view of the villages and villages of India, folk songs of different localities, and then make up their mind about nationalism, because nationalism is not just Tagore's idea or Anderson's idea, or the whole notion of ghare baire that we studied. So it's very important for us to understand that there's a distinction between activism and protest. Not only this government, previous governments have also not had a very good track record in the minds of intellectuals when it came to student protests. We all know about emergency. We all know about what happened when that whole
right. You're coming to the end of your 1 minute now. Almost to the end of your 1 minute. Yes. You reiterated the points. Abhinav, 1 minute approximately.
Thank you. So to conclude, I'd really like to tell everyone here that before I went abroad, I studied law in a college called the Government Law College in Mumbai, and it was set up in the 1850s during the colonial period. And the motto of this college, set up during the colonial period, was Nevel Fano in Latin, which means let nothing evil enter. And by nothing evil, the college administration were really worried about political protest. You see, they didn't want lawyers, they didn't want law students protesting, because they knew how dangerous that could be to the existence of the British regime in India. So make no mistake about it, the administration is very worried about students who protest. In the 1970s, the Navnirman movement in Gujarat, the JP movement in Bihar, which was alluded to, threatened to topple the Congress government and was cited as a cause for imposing the emergency in June 1975. Thomas Emerson.
Quickly wrap up. We're coming to the end of your minute.
Okay, well, in that case, if I have one sentence, I'll only say, if there was a law that were enacted by Parliament that college students should not participate in political protests, it would be struck down overwhelmingly as being unconstitutional. It is overbroad. Right. It distinguishes between college students and high school students. It doesn't define what protests are. So
and that's all I really have to say. That's more than a sentence. Thank you, Abhinav. Thank you very much. I knew you had to conclude your argument, but I just had to throw the scalpel in there. Okay, the results are in, and I just want to make two very quick points. I know you want to know which side won or which argument won. To make a point, you often have to take the extreme part. But there was consensus, I think, amongst all four, that no one was supporting hate speech or violence, and some of the arguments that stood on hate speech and violence, there was a consensus that no, that's not something students should be doing. On the other hand, there was also reasonable consensus around the fact that enlightened activism is something that students must do, and enlightened activism is not as conflatable with protest as some may want to do. So I think there was this body of consensus amongst all the four speakers. But of course, they made their points. I don't want to. I made my points right at the beginning, and I sort of hold to them. And I'm a bit in agreement, if I'm allowed to display my bias. And I think the debate's come to an end, so I'm allowed to display my bias a bit now. The results are in, and let me tell you what the results are. So when we started the first vote, we had 47% who thought they were for and 53 against. Now there's been a fairly massive swing in favor of against. Now the for vote is 26%. 26% of the people believe that students should not take part in politics, but 74% are now saying that students should take part in political protest. Sorry, I'd said politics, political protest. Students should. So 21 percentage points of a swing in favor of against. So everybody wins, but on this reckoning, on this touchstone, on this yardstick, the day is today carried by against. Ratna, is that enough to conclude now?
Absolutely. That was really, really quite fantastic. Thank you so much to all our panelists and to our audience for that fantastic debate where everyone got to argue, got to speak, and everyone was heard. Also, a big thanks to our partners that have made this possible. Tata Literature Live, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej. It continues with many more sessions. Do check out the website. And if you want to spend some time in a virtual bookshop, head on to landmarkexcite.com. Coming up at 9 p.m. tonight, celebrating women, the Shashi Baliga Memorial Session, Indefatigable. It's a portrait of the dear, warm, funny, and wonderful human being of a writer as a feminist icon, with Rebecca Solnit in conversation with Menka Goswami. With that, I'll be signing off. A big thank you once again to all our panelists and our sponsors. Thank you and see you soon.